So yes, hi everyone. My name is Tyler Colburn. I am here with the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. I am the professional development consultant. You're joining for our second series of Active Hope. This one is focused on queer and climate justice. I am facilitating and hosting today. Yes, today's February 28th, 2024, 2025. Oh gosh, it's 2025, not 2024. And also it's hard to believe that we're 1/6 of the way through the year. Like January felt like it was so long, and then February has felt like it is so short. I know it's a shorter month anyway, but I've been shocked by how fast these 2 months have gone. But again, yeah, I'm so grateful folks are here with me today for this session. I'm looking forward to sharing some insights into how we might be able to adopt a queer perspective around climate justice as we, as social workers, hopefully strive for social justice and climate justice. I'm going to run through a few things here. Before we get started, I would like you to acknowledge the land that you're on, and please join me in this. I want to begin by acknowledging that the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers resides and is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. The office of the College of Social Workers is in Chipuktuk. I normally am in Punamukutijik, which is colonially known as Dartmouth. Again, as I said at the start of this call, I'm in Dagmankuk, colonially known as Newfoundland, on the island of Newfoundland in St. John's. I want to name the inherent rights of the Mi'kmaq were recognized in the peace and friendship treaties signed with the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy peoples from 1725 to 1779. I also want to acknowledge that the land I'm on today was also the home of the Beothuk, who were killed and murdered and displaced and have disappeared from history due to the rise of settler colonialism. The series of treaties did not surrender Indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty to the British Empire, but instead established rules for ongoing relationships between nations. Canada later reaffirmed the treaties in Section 35 of the Constitution Act of 1982, and they remain active to this day. Just going to open the chat here, see some notes coming in. Hi. Oh, thanks. Hi, folks. So I'm hoping that you take some time to pause in reflection and gratitude for the land where we live and work. It's really important to understand that decolonization and acknowledging the land and supporting Indigenous resistance and resurgence is essential to climate justice, in my opinion. In the chat here, I am going to put in the link to the public presentation. So the presentation I'm going through right now, you're welcome to view that link on your own. It will be helpful for the discussions later. I also am going to put in the placenames.mapdev.ca. So if I'd love for you to join me in this land acknowledgement and name the land you're on. I also have the evaluation survey link in there as well. So when we acknowledge the land, it's important that we also begin to acknowledge the wisdom of this planet and align ourselves with its truth. So image on the side, you might have seen this before, it's been on some of my calls, but I like it and I want to keep it. The tree stump and human fingerprints. So this understanding that we are not separate and distinct from nature. We are not here to dominate over Earth, but the Earth is a living entity that we are an expression of. I love this quote from Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures. I'm going to use some of the resources later. But it says, understand that the earth is not an extension of our bodies, it's the other way around. So, as we think about queering climate justice and addressing climate justice as social workers, how might that be different if we consider ourselves as expressions of this land? Let's take this moment to pause in gratitude for all who have and continue to heroically care and advocate for this beautiful land. May we join them in this sacred work, thinking of water protectors and land defenders engaged in resistance in Mi'kma'ki, throughout Turtle Island, and also around the world. Let us ground ourselves in the wisdom of the land-based Mi'kmaq teachings and values that we must all begin to learn. Let us work to decolonize ourselves, our practice, in this community that we share by working for justice for all living beings as an expression of our gratitude for being here. Let us take a deep breath and recenter ourselves away from the violent ways colonization fills our world and fills us. And then let us take a deep breath and work on letting go of the unconscious bias that is everywhere, inside and out. Pardon me here, I'm just making sure. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so may our session today lead us to be in right relationship with this land and with one another. Important also to remind, in Mi'kma'ki, we are all treaty people. And so as we understand if you're a settler Canadian like myself, what is our obligation to uphold the treaty rights? How do we advocate for and work within policy and legislation from a colonial standpoint so that we can do a better job of upholding treaty rights and having that nation-to-nation relationship, which is enshrined in the treaties? So how does this impact our work we were doing today and how we do it? How will it guide our work going forward? Hi, nice to see some familiar names and people in from all over Mi'kma'ki. It's important that we also translate acknowledgement into action. So it's so common and often in this world and in this work that we hear land acknowledgement. And it sounds like a checkbox, but land acknowledgement is so much more, or the work of decolonization, I should say, is so much more than using nice words. It's about changing the material conditions that led to and sustained settler colonialism. So we see this work at the college in professional development as a way to learn and unlearn and to contribute to and commit to truth and reconciliation, decolonization, and Indigenous resurgence. I also want to acknowledge reparations for people of African descent, distinct and separate from the land acknowledgement and the rights and treaties of people of Indigenous descent and Indigenous people and Mi'kmaq people. But it is also important to draw to attention to the fact that settler colonialism was also a driving force and motivator behind the enslavement and displacement of people of African descent. And so here at the college, we have a commitment to reparations, and not just a moral commitment, but a material obligation. So aligning resources and energy towards reparations. And for us, that looks like restitution, compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and then guarantees of non-repetition. So ensuring that it never happens again. It's also important to acknowledge the history of people of African descent in Nova Scotia, and this is marked by resilience, contribution, and profound influence in the province's social fabric. From the Black Loyalists and the Maroons to the Southern American Black refugees, the legacy of these communities have indelibly shaped Nova Scotia's cultural landscape. Their stories, marked by perseverance in the face of adversity, are central to our shared history and necessitate both recognition and restitution. In the link that I put in earlier to this presentation, there's the link at the bottom here to our Emancipation Day reparations blog post from 2024. And it talks more about the college's commitment. I also want to highlight that the two final sessions of Active Hope, so session 4 and 5, will be grounded in anti-Black racism and speaking to climate injustice, environmental racism from a African Nova Scotian and person of African descent lens, while also drawing in threads of Indigenous resistance as well. So then finally, it's important as well that we just take a side. Neutrality does not support social justice. It doesn't move us forward towards justice and more harmonious world that we hopefully are desiring to live in as social workers. So it's just never taking a neutral position on climate injustice or queer injustice or queer liberation doesn't help you, but you have to take a side. You have to take a position, an ideological position and a political position. And so when we think about our code of ethics, so the CASW's code of ethics and our upcoming revised code of ethics, it's about taking a position and moving towards justice. Some framing from our time together today. Your engagement with the session may not have immediate and or practical applications for you, and that is okay. So this idea that in a capitalist society, we often come to sessions or learning believing that our expectations will get 100% met, or that we will agree with everything that's been said and really benefit from everything that's been said and discussed. But that may or may not be true for you. So just inviting you to have a sense of curiosity about the session today. You don't have to agree with anything presented or shared, but ask that you be open to seeing what happens. So just taking a learner research position or having a sense of curiosity about the topics today. There's many professionals here on this call today, and you all might have worked in this space before or have a care and interest in climate justice. And so there might be differences of opinion or views shared in the small group discussions, and that's all right. I encourage folks to take responsibility for yourself by observing and learning from your unconscious and conscious responses. These are big topics, and I know as social workers we can tangle and wrestle with complex and complicated subjects. But just be aware of what you're experiencing. Try to notice if you're having some experiences in your body that might be eliciting, like you might be having a strong response to something that I or someone else may say. Also encourage you folks to take care of yourselves, use the bathroom, eat your food, do what you need to do on this call. Trust that you're all adults and can do that. It's up to you to decide how much you want to share and participate. So thinking a little bit about those small group discussions or maybe in a larger group discussion, we don't have a huge group today. Encourage people to push themselves and to share and use your voice and your camera or the chat to, to contribute to the conversation, but it's up to you to decide how much you want to share. And then finally, we can all engage in ways that support others. So I often say that like this is not a space for therapy. This is not a space for a therapeutic approach. This isn't a clinical setting. However, we can all engage in ways that support each other. So through our small discussions, through the content that I'm sharing today, the larger group discussions, this can still be a place that contributes to healing. So agenda, check in the chat. I'll share the framing for that in a second. I'm going to do a little bit of a presentation on queering climate justice and social work. And then we're going to have some small group discussions and some sharebacks. And then I'll do a checkout and talk about next steps. So point to some other activities that are coming up for the college. So the check-in, I'm hoping, and I know some folks have already checked in here as well, but I'd love to hear how are you arriving? So as we start this call today, what's on your heart, your body, your mind, your spirit? What are you thinking about holding on to as you sit here and engage in this call? Would love for you to name the land that you're on. Mi'kmaq Place Names is a great resource for that. And then what motivated you to attend today? And so I'm going to be going through a few things. But I'd love to see some messages coming in the chat about how you're arriving the land that you're on and what motivated you to attend today. So some objectives for today. These are the event, right? So I won't go through them fully, but I'm hoping that we build some knowledge together. So I'm going to share some knowledge that's been gifted to me and things that I found online, but also believe that we co-create knowledge in these spaces. So hoping people have a deeper understanding of the climate emergency, social justice, and how queerness relates to it. I also hope that there's an understanding developed about the difference between passive and active hope. Skills, we'll be developing skills and engaging discussions with others around complex topics like sustainability, queerness, and how to carry forward this work in our own agency and context. I'm hoping that each of you can identify actions of hope within yourselves and each other that you can implement to develop or address, to implement or to address the climate emergency. Apologies, I'm tripping over my words. And values. I'm hoping that there's some shifts in feelings and attitudes around the climate emergency and queerness, and as social workers' roles in creating and sustaining active hope. Hi, Dom. Thanks for checking in. Motivated to encourage social workers to engage with active hope on the issues of climate change. Agreed. For folks who are on this call who are members of the College of Social Workers, just a reminder that this session is considered formal professional development. So if you are here for the whole call, please to claim this as formal professional development in your yearly registration and renewals. For folks who might be watching this on YouTube later, this also is considered formal professional development. I want to highlight a few of the code of ethics that are grounding this session today in the series of Active Hope. The first one is value two, promoting social justice. So principle 2.5 in the NSCSW guiding principles, and then guiding principle 2.4 for CASW. Social workers advocate for the stewardship of natural resources and the protection of the environment for the common good of all people. I would bridge that one step further and say, not just for the common good of all people, but for the common good of the planet. Thinking again as if we are expressions of the planet, we are doing this not just for ourselves and for each other, but for the interconnected ecosystems that we are all engaged in. So some things that we do under Guiding Principle 2.5 for the college: promote the protection of the environment, land, air, and water, plants, and animals. We identify how climate change exacerbates social inequalities. We understand how environmental racism impacts people. We also understand how systemic oppression is perpetuated. And then finally, social workers acknowledge the rights of Indigenous peoples to steward their own lands, and calling back to this idea that decolonization and supporting Indigenous resistance and resurgence is central to addressing climate justice. Hi, Allison. Thank you so much for checking in. Totally hear you. You're here in whatever way you can be here. So some other things we do, within considering guiding principle 25. So understanding the impacts of climate change, specifically on marginalized and oppressed groups. We support environmental protections. We also facilitate access to adaptation resources, advocate for policies that address environmental racism, uphold the constitutional treaty rights of Mi'kmaq people, and then also wanting to incorporate Mi'kmaq and Indigenous perspectives in environmental efforts. I think it's a central point to the resistance of white supremacy and settler colonialism. So also we're respecting the dignity and worth of all people, so value one, and also value three, pursuing truth and reconciliation. So as we strive for leadership grounded in Mi'kmaq values and principles and ways of knowing and being, we also want to be aligning resources and energy so that we can let the original stewards of this land continue to exercise their treaty rights and their rights as First Nations to guide us towards climate justice. So, want to remind some folks what is the problem that we're addressing today? What is the topic at hand? And so, this is from the last session. These slides were put together by Dominic Boyd, who's on the call today. So we can't solve the problem by using the same thinking that when creating it. So as we're thinking about climate injustice and the climate emergency, we can't use the same solutions, systems, tools that have created the problem. There's an analogy that you may have heard before, but you can't use the same thing that caused the wound to act as the band-aid. I probably screwed that up in terms of how it's supposed to be said, but this idea that the same thing that causes the harm can't be the thing that is the solution to preventing or addressing the harm. So we know that our atmosphere is warming and that climate change is directly related to the production and the use of greenhouse gases or of fossil fuels that contribute to greenhouse gases. We also know that global heating is impacting the most vulnerable populations, and then we're already seeing the impacts, in places like if we think of Turtle Island, Florida and California come to mind, the flooding that was happening through the central US, the wildfires that we had here a couple of years ago, the increases in turbulent and extreme weather. So as we're holding on to this idea of the problem, I call or ask you folks, and I'll share some ideas on this. How does queerness relate to climate justice? What is green social work? And so, thinking about our role as social workers who are striving for climate justice, the goal ultimately is that humanity's basic needs are met and the planet Earth is sustained as a living entity. So, how do we find a way to work in harmony with the planet and ourselves so that we're not overextending the capacity of the resources and the energy that we have on this planet, so that we're working in reciprocal ways, working and living in reciprocal ways that honor and respect the idea of this planet as a living entity? It also critiques political and economic systems that are destroying our planet and creating suffering and misery for many millions and billions of people around the world. It also argues for profound transformation of these systems, and it works at all levels. So, when thinking about those levels, we have the macro, meso, and the micro. At the macro level, we're addressing and critiquing political and economic systems and advocating. At the meso level, we're critiquing policy and agencies. We're proposing effective and dignified programming. The session next month in March will be led by Kate Matheson, one of our registered social workers. And they'll be talking a lot more about the meso system. So if you're curious about how you might be able to apply a critical lens and advocate for policies that are at the meso level within your own agencies and contexts, I really encourage you to come to the session in March. And then micro, assisting people in addressing consequences of global heating, such as disasters, and building capacity and resilience. And so, for clinicians who might be on this call or clinical specialists, thinking a lot about service users and clients who might be dealing with, existential despair or climate grief or climate sorrow. So, that's some of the preamble for this session. I'm going to start diving into the queer elements of this session now. But I wanted to start off by just naming who I am. So again, Tyler Colburn, professional development consultant. I do have a BSW and MSW, and I'm registered here with the college. I am a settler Canadian of Irish descent. I use the term settler to define the fact that I'm not indigenous to these lands, that I came here through the process of settler colonialism. Um, I live in Punamukutijik with my partner, downtown Dartmouth. Very blessed and privileged to be able to build a life here in Mi'kma'ki. Feel really honored to be a guest on these lands, and I feel an accountability and responsibility to be addressing the issues of settler colonialism in my work, in my personal life, my practice. I grew up in a rural area. I grew up in Greenwood in a military family on both sides. And I'm the first person who went to university in my family, first person who graduated high school. So I'm a bit of an outlier, which is a common theme for me in terms of my queerness, my family, but I feel really grateful to have the life and the connections and the kin that I have. I have diverse work and education experiences. I often talk about how I've had over 51 jobs. I've been everything from a flight attendant to a pirate on a tall ship to a photographer. I've also been a bartender, a youth outreach worker. God, I've been a deckhand. I've done all kinds of different work. A youth project leader, a tour guide. Yeah, I've done lots of interesting and diverse things, and I feel really privileged to have done so much in such a short time. I'm only 40. But I'm now a social worker, and I really came into this work kind of by choice late. I got a degree when I was 36, after many years of trying, and I just only completed my MSW last year. I am an artist, dog lover, weirdo. I'm into all kinds of fun community art-based things. I really care about decolonization and climate justice. But the most important thing I think that's helpful for me to share is that from a very young age, I was aware of my queerness. Growing up in a heteronormative context in a military family, with folks who face barriers, through our generations. um, my queerness wasn't really embraced, wasn't understood. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and I often think back to how, from a very young age, I started to question my place in the world, because I knew that the model that was working, well, not working so well for my family either, but working for my parents and for others in our community wasn't the model that was going to work for me. So before I understood um, that I was gay or queer, before I understood heteronormativity, before I understood so many different elements of the life and what I was experiencing, I knew that I was different. And so I started to see and believe beyond the model that was presented to me. So from a young age, queerness pushed me to see beyond binaries. Yeah, I feel very often like I talk about the fact that I'm not really sure how I came into my queerness. My family didn't present it to me. I didn't really have anyone, no queer elders or folks in my community to point to. The only thing I had was maybe Xena the Warrior Princess and Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which could have turned me queer. Who knows? But there wasn't a lot of examples when I was younger, so I feel privileged to live in a time where so many young people have examples in the media, social media, popular media, film and television, books, for people to consider queerness. Elaine, I just saw that you raised your hand. If you want to just send me a message privately, that'd be helpful because I'm just going to maintain this sort of one-way directional content, and then we'll get into discussions. So, what is queerness? This is a very quick screen grab from Google. And I want to point to the definition, the second one first. So, often people think of queerness in terms of sexuality and gender identity and expression. So, the quality or characteristic of having a sexual or gender identity. Oh, thanks, Elaine. That was a thumbs up. Okay, cool. I appreciate that. The quality or characteristic of having a sexual or gender identity that does not correspond to established ideas of sexuality and gender, especially heterosexual norms. So when I think about, my upbringing and my questioning of my identity and my community really early on, it was this idea that I was somewhere outside the norm. But in terms of this content today and thinking about queer and climate justice, I actually want to point to the first one. So, number one of the definition of this noun, queerness, says the state or condition of being strange or odd. Some people on this call might be from the generation where queer might have been more often used to say weird or different. It's something that's quite used here in Newfoundland, still to this day. And there's maybe people who don't like the term queer. Maybe it feels uncomfortable for them. It's something that I use all the time. But I want to point to this idea of condition of being strange or odd. So thinking about queerness as being outside of the norm. I also want to just touch briefly on queer theory. So, queer theory, this is a quote from the Indiana University of Bloomington. I found some resources online, and this is one that I really liked. And it states that queer theory is an interdisciplinary field that encourages one to look at the world through new avenues. So, again, seeing outside of the dominant norms and is a way of thinking that dismantles traditional assumptions about gender and sexual identities. It challenges traditional academic approaches and fights against social inequality. So it's important to understand that queerness and queer theory is not just a theory. It's many different ways of approaching theory. It's a way of thinking that can be applied to complex challenges such as climate justice. And so encouraging folks in this call to just adopt a position or a queer lens that just sees beyond dominance. It sees outside of binaries. It goes beyond the norms. So I see queerness as an invitation to see beyond dominance and that it pushes against heteronormative or even normative ideas and assumptions, recognizing and acknowledging diversity of gender identities and sexual expression and sexual orientation, but I also want to name it does have limits and faults. Queerness is often framed through a white supremacist and settler colonial logic. Um, and even though it can often be perceived or embraced or communicated in that way or held in sort of a privileged position, it can also be about living in response to those systems. It can also be about living in resistance to those systems. So again, if we can hold a position that is beyond binary, beyond dominance, beyond the norms, we can see queerness and queer theory as imperfect, but also useful. So I see climate justice and queerness as interconnected, and I think it's important to see this as interconnected to be able to strive for socially just practice that strives for climate justice. It's also important to take a decolonial approach along with queering because that can help us strive for ethical practice as social workers. And I really want to name this quote from Absalon from 2016, where they say, "Land and spirit are intrinsically connected." When taking a queer position that kind of pushes through and tries to challenge and dismantle white supremacy and settler colonial logic, um, it can be helpful to understand that those forces, settler colonialism and white supremacy, have denied many people an understanding that they are interconnected to many different areas of life in the world, that they're entangled in systems, and that they are expressions of the land, and that our spirit and our land are interconnected. This is an indigenous position. This comes from some of my studies in decolonial social work at the University of Victoria. But I just think it's important to hold on to this idea that land and spirit are intrinsically connected. Also, again, holding on to this idea that decolonization and queering are connected. This is from Hunt and Holmes. This is an article I use all the time. But they view decolonization and queering as active, interconnected, critical, and everyday practices that take place within and across diverse spaces and time. So understanding that it's an everyday pursuit. So if you're querying things or you're striving to take a decolonial approach, it's an everyday practice. It's not just something you do at work, it's something you try to do in your day-to-day living. So what? Queerness and climate justice. I wanted to highlight this quote by Cosmo and Recollet, that queerness on the land is about our relationships to destruction, to imagining our bodies beyond a city/bush divide, to making space for all of creation. Queerness is about living in responses to the world that's been created around us, to finding ourselves in spaces like the city dump and meeting our animal kin there. Just thought that was a really beautiful quote about this idea of queerness and connecting to the land. So what about queerness and climate grief? In working with service users or within community groups or community-based organizations or in agencies, you might be working with people or yourselves in experiencing climate grief or climate sorrow. Um, how can we adopt a queer lens to support people, support our service users, and maybe ourselves and other clinicians? I think it's important to support an intersectional and interconnected view of climate injustice and despair. It's important to help service users name and process their feelings. And it's also important to help people sit within paradox and complexity. So, again, taking this queer lens and seeing beyond dominance and binaries, seeing things as a spectrum. And so, something can be both, not good, but also helpful. And seeing things in those ways can be maybe opening doors and pathways to moving beyond dominance. And of course, it's important to support the development of active hope. Um, I want to name these quotes here again from Decolonial Futures. This is from the Without Modernity cards. There's a link in the references. I use these cards all the time. But two of the cards have two different statements that I've combined. And one says, "How can we face the end of the world without despair?" And this doesn't have to mean the cataclysmic side of end of the world. It doesn't have to mean what we see in television and film, reading books, or even in the news right now. It can also mean the end of certain ways of knowing and being. It can be the end of dominance. It can be about, and I'm borrowing from Vanessa Andreotti here, but it can be about hospicing modernity. It can be about moving beyond the situation we're in now and finding a new way to move forward. It doesn't have to be that cataclysmic point of view, even though we know that tragedy and suffering and extreme weather events are happening and will happen again. The other card asks, how can being overwhelmed and disillusioned be productive? And challenging here the idea of productivity from a capitalistic mindset, but more so like how can it help us have new understanding? How can it help us prioritize? How can it help us move forward with a sense of urgency and hope? Because the issues we are facing today are urgent and critical. I also want to name, I'm part of a climate grief group that meets once a month on the third Thursday in Dartmouth. And I've only gone a couple of times, but it's this really amazing group that is based off death cafes out of the UK. And they've adapted it to climate grief and climate sorrow. This is a bit of a funny story. At least I think it's funny. Um, we go to this group, and there's a clinician and then someone who's from the community who might not be clinical or a clinician, but they both sort of host space for these conversations. And there's a few different rounds, and each round has a different prompt. But the first round, say there's a group of 10 people, there's about 10 people the first time I went. people share a story or what's on their mind. They're sort of checking in and talking about what they're experiencing, and through that story, the clinician in the room, the person who's hosting that conversation, will help them name what they're experiencing. What are the feelings and emotions that might be coming up? So, one person shared a story, and the clinician was like, "Sounds like you're angry," right? The next person shared a story. It sounds like you're sad. And finally, after a few rounds, it got to me, and so I shared my story and talked about what I was experiencing and thinking, and we took as much space as everyone else did. And at the end of my time, the clinician went, "You have a lot of emotions." And it really stands out for me, and I just replied, "You should ask my partner." But I want to point to the fact that when considering climate grief, climate sorrow, existential despair, we can have a lot of emotions. We're living in unprecedented times, and so whatever you might be experiencing or feeling is true for you. And it's quite terrifying at times to think about these existential issues. And we can't let that despair, and that fear, and that sense of struggle that we might be having limit us from having hope and finding something better. I'm getting close to the end of my time speaking. We're going into small group discussions, but I just want to go through a couple more things. So again, just to summarize, to practice ethically as social workers, we have to see beyond binaries and dominance and support others to embrace this view. That's an opinion that I have. I believe that to practice ethically, we have to be able to sit within complexity and paradox, and we should be striving for other people to adopt that view as well. We want to see things as interconnected across socially constructed identities, and we want to be able to move beyond colonial frameworks and worldviews. Again, this idea that the problems that have been created were um, are created in a context and a time, and we can't use the same solutions of that context and that time to try to move forward with justice. Meaning, the things that created the climate emergency are not going to be the things that solve the climate emergency. Incremental shifts in a settler, colonial, and white supremacist logic are not going to be able to be fundamental enough to actually move us towards justice and harmony, and adaptation to the climate emergency. So, what about hope? Queerness and hope are interconnected. Queer people have been, and all oppressed people have been, dreaming of better futures since the beginning of time. For anyone who's on this call who might have felt oppressed or experienced oppression or harm or suffering, or even just by the fact that you became social workers or helpers, makes me think that you believe in a better world, that you believe something better is possible. So, as we tangle or wrestle with the complex issues of climate injustice and adaptation, how do we activate that sense of hope? How do we tie into that reason and that belief about why we became social workers, why we became helpers, why we thought there might be a better opportunity for all of us collectively or individually? It's also important that we see beyond binaries and allow us to see hope as a possibility beyond the limits of dominance. So something out there is unknowable and in the future, and it's possible that we can get there, but we can't clearly define it yet. So how do we have hope for something that we can't really name or feel? There's a quote here from Munoz from 2009. This is from a queer um, um, book. I can't remember the name of it offhand, but I really like this idea of hope from a queer lens. It says, in part, we must take on a kind of abstract hope that is not much more than merely wishing, and instead we need to participate in a more concrete hope, what Ernst Bloch would call an educated hope. The kind is grounded and consequential, a mode of hoping that is cognizant of exactly what obstacles present themselves in the face of obstacles that so often feel insurmountable. I'm going to share a couple of resources before we get into small chats. These will be in the link again, so if you have access to the documents. I'll put that in the chat again. Some people have just joined. You have access to this presentation. It's the first link that I just shared. There's a link to this. This is from the 519. This is presented to me by Jessica Castle. They run Rocky Road Counseling, and I wanted to name them just because this was a resource that I've never heard of before, but it had some interesting context in there that connect into this idea that queer liberation and climate justice are interwoven, entangled, and interconnected. And so in this report, the executive summary and the report call for asset mapping and collaboration, community knowledge and leadership, advocating for climate justice, community investment, cultivating connected, resilient communities, having an all hazards community preparedness response, and then also organizational resilience. So for queer organizations or for organizations that might, be working towards climate or queer justice, making sure that they have a sense of resilience and resources that can stand outside of like funding models, etc. but they end with a better world is possible. So if you're on this call and maybe you're feeling a little of despair or existential despair or suffering or sorrow around climate, I encourage you to read this executive summary or report. It's quite wonderful. I also think it's important to look to other people who are doing this work. And so there's a great Instagram account here that I came across called Queers for Climate Justice. And one of their central questions they ask is, what is one solution to climate chaos in your community? So before we get into small group discussions, I just wanted to have one more thought around here around queerness and allyship. Um, we can't have a conversation around queerness and queering climate justice without acknowledging the rise of fascism, the rise of alt-right, um, Christian nationalism, I would call it. I also think we see it here in, Mi'kma'ki and Nova Scotia and North America and Canada and across Turtle Island. But we're really seeing it in the States right now, quite presently. There's a rise of anti-2S LGBTQI plus hate. I know I experience it. Sometimes people message me and call me groomer or all kinds of other things. But it's a part of moral panic. We know that there is many people working to remove the rights and freedoms that have been afforded and given to queer people. And this will be disproportionately impacting Black and Indigenous and people of color who are queer. So we just want to make sure that we're understanding that queer liberation and climate justice are entangled, and also just name that a lot of what's happening is moral panic. Politicians and leaders are whipping up a frenzy of fear around queerness that is disproportionate to the risk. Thinking about trans people in particular, and this push to remove them from sports or make sure that they're using the bathroom for, the sex that they were assigned at birth. And the reality is, trans people are such a small part of our population, and they're such a brilliant, wonderful, creative, thoughtful, productive part of our population. And so limiting the rights and freedoms actually doesn't do anything beneficial for the rest of society. So it's a waste of energy, it's a waste of resources, and it's a moral panic that's being used by political leaders to hide more nefarious things. So be critical of the moral panic. I also want to name that we're seeing an increase in people requesting to become social workers in Nova Scotia from the US. I do get emails fairly regularly from people who are asking to move to Canada. And so we are seeing a rise of that as well. So we're seeing a migration of people and professionals who have the privilege to be able to maybe move. So naming active hope spiral as well. This is from our last session, but thinking about this way to activate our hope, these questions can be, or these prompts can be helpful for activating a sense of hope. One, I love blank. So, what are the things that you feel and care deeply about? Where can you have gratitude? I'd like to thank. Looking at the future, my concerns are blank. Facing these concerns, what inspires me is. What I hope for in the future is. A part I'd like to play is. A step I'll take during the next week is. These are really helpful for reflective prompts. So if you have a journaling practice or if you're engaged in any kind of self-reflective activities, these can be helpful for activating a sense of hope. So if you might be locked into a sense of despair or feeling overwhelmed and disillusioned by the existential issues we're facing, stepping into active hope through these prompts can be really useful. And then my question that I'm adding to this is, how might we see queerness as a gateway to addressing climate injustice and ethical social work practice? So again, seeing beyond dominance and binaries, how does queerness activate a sense of hope in us for addressing climate justice? So we're going to move into the small group discussions. I know I've been talking for quite some time. My mouth's getting quite dry, but I'm hoping that we can have some conversations in the small groups to process some of this and think about this. So I have some Zoom housekeeping I want to go through. In a few moments, I am going to break you into small groups of, I think, 5 people in each group. So you'll get a notification that you're going to be pulled into a room, depending whether you're joining this call from a computer or a tablet or your phone. It might look a little differently, but you're going to get a pop-up window either way that says join a breakout room. Click join, and that should take you over to the small breakout room where you're going to meet a couple other, 4 or 5 other people. If you have any problems, send me a message. I'll stick around in the main room if there's any challenges with people connecting. You're also going to be given a predetermined amount of time to chat, probably 20, 25 minutes. When the call is about to end, you're going to see a pop-up window that says that the breakout rooms are going to close, and you'll have a 60-second countdown. Pardon me. Um, and so you'll have time to chat, hopefully enough time. It's never enough time, but you will have 20, 25 minutes to chat. And it's just important that you also build connections and build relationships. So introduce yourselves, get to know each other, and then these prompts, again, they're in the presentation link, so I encourage you to click that so you have them, because once you go into the breakout rooms, you won't see my share screen anymore. So please click on the links that are in the chat. This is on slide, oh gosh, I can't tell. I think it's somewhere towards the end of the presentation, but you should be able to find it. But the questions I'm hoping you explore are what is coming up for you around active hope and addressing climate change as social workers through a queer's lens. So if you can adopt a queer position, a queer viewpoint, how does that help us in activating hope and addressing climate change? When thinking about the different levels of social work, so micro, meso, macro, how might we see queerness as a gateway to addressing climate injustice and ethical social work practice? And then how can adopting a queer lens generate hope in addressing climate injustice? What is an action we can take that brings in a queer lens to this issue? So thinking about maybe next week, what's something that you can do that you might be able to adopt through a queer lens to address the issue of climate injustice? After that, we'll come back to and hopefully have a share back with a couple of voices to be able to make sense of the information that we're generating here together. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I am going to put us into small groups. I'm also going to end the recording for right now, but we will record again when we return. So you will not be recorded in the small room. Hi, folks. Welcome back. I was just saying to the other folks in the smaller room that it's always so awkward to press that button. It's like, come back to the main room. And it's like always the most important thought at the end that someone's trying to communicate, and then it's like cut off. However, we are a smaller group now. There's only the 11 or 10 of us, and just wanted to continue the conversation. So I was wondering, what are some of the things that came up for you folks in the smaller rooms? Like any themes or ideas or critiques, even? Love to hear from either the chat or the use your voice or camera to just sort of share what came up in your small discussions. Dominic, I might pick on you because I know you're.
Dominic also had
There
some
we
great
go.
resources for books as well that you might want to share with the larger group, Dominic.
We had some books come up in our chat too. Good. Okay, cool.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we talked about I mentioned the book, the Green Social Work book, Thich Nhat Hanh's Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet, the Active Hope book, and Sharon Salzberg's book on real change. So yeah, we talked in our little group about how um, the queer community and other minorities and oppressed groups have learned a lot about advocacy and how um, how people who want to create a world where climate justice happens need to look at it's not just the technical problem of solving global warming. It's more the problem of rebuilding our societies, of creating a new kind of society that is much more socially just and inclusive, and that we need to listen to people from all of the oppressed groups in our society to learn from them and to see what they bring to the table as relevant and helpful, rather than carry on with oppressing people the way the dominant structures seem to be doing in our
Mm,
country and in other countries. So it's about building a new world, building a new world order. It's inclusive of all life, and we feel that social workers an important role in this, but we haven't really been talking about it enough. And now we
mm,
have started the conversation, and we want to see it continue. We also considered about, for instance, Dalhousie School of Social Work. Where are they in all this? Do
mm,
they teach a green social work course there? I don't know. But I thought, well, maybe it'd be worth finding out what's happening and not just Dal, but perhaps some of the other schools of social work as well. Um, and there's 3,000 members in our college. Are there ways we could all unite as one voice on these issues? These are some things to think about as well.
mm, mm. Thanks, Dominic.
Yeah.
I'm wondering for the other small group that I was in, so it was Jordy, Norma Jean, Leslie, Allison, and Kim, I believe. Anything that's kind of bubbling up for you that you want to share with this other group? I'll share a little bit of what came up in that group discussion. One person, I believe it might have been, oh gosh, I can't remember who it was now, talked about the work of Loretta Ross and calling people in versus calling people out. If you're not familiar with Loretta Ross, she's a Black feminist movement worker out of the States who's been working in reproductive justice for generations. And she has this really amazing TED Talk that I put in the chat. Um, for our small group. Not sure if it went to everyone, but I encourage you to check it out, Loretta Ross. This idea of calling people in. And so instead of shaming, judging, calling people out, trying to divide them based on a moral or a political position, is there a way that we can deepen relationships and build connections over difference? And this comes from transformative justice movements that Loretta has been connected to. It's a really great TED Talk, and a lot of her work really speaks with this idea of like the person who has a poor opinion next door, your neighbor, maybe they say some offensive things. They're not trying to kill you, but the legislator in the House of Commons might be, you know? So this idea of like follow the power and an analysis that allows you to try build connections with those who are in the community, but really address the problems that are being sustained and reproduced by the folks who have the most power. And that's not to say that people who say offensive things shouldn't be, you know, um, guided towards being better and having better opinions and better views and better ways of expressing themselves. Is just knowing who is the enemy actually, because we live in this world that likes to divide us. Um, we also talked about some other frameworks and this idea about trauma being, maybe overly simple at times. This idea of trauma being, and purely through an individual lens is limiting in our understanding of like what is the harm, what is the generational harms, what are the things that people actually experience over time. It's not just an individual experience of trauma; it's greater than that. Um, Also talked a little bit about the challenge of trying to see beyond binaries and dominance and trying to embrace a decolonial point of view, because it can be very abstract at times. It's maybe not pragmatic or tangible in certain moments, and having to wrestle with that. Sometimes in our society, it's easy to want simple solutions or find out what our next step is, and in this unprecedented time with so many existential threats, it's hard to know where to take the first step, right? And how that can be debilitating at times. Hopefully that summarizes some of our conversation. I wonder if anyone else is open to talking, and that's okay if you're not. Hmm. Well, folks, we are almost at time, so I will share a few things, and I'm gonna put my screen back up here. Hopefully that people can see that. Apologies, it's so small. But I'm curious in the chat, if you could, please put in the chat, what are you leaving with today and what might be giving you hope? So just take a few moments to reflect on this conversation. And in the chat, just share a couple words of what are you leaving with today? It could be an idea, a concept, it could be a feeling, it could be information. And what might be giving you hope at the moment? For me, for instance, I can share, what am I leaving with today? Like gratitude for folks who came today. Queering climate justice is important to me. Um, but I'm also leaving with little bit of a sense of hope. I didn't share this earlier, but I'm actually in Newfoundland for a funeral. So it's been a really tangly week. And as I was getting ready for this call today, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm in like multiple emotional states at the moment. How am I going to do this? But getting to engage in conversation with you folks was really activating for me in a hopeful way. So I'm feeling a bit of that, and I'm just grateful for the conversations. That's giving me a sense of hope and seeing people show up for this conversation. But I'd love to see in the chat from other folks, what are you leaving with and what is giving you hope? Also want to just point to the references. So this is in the slides again. I am just going to post the things into the chat. Reminder, you have access to this presentation. It's publicly available. So you can look at the resources or use any of the information if you'd like. And I also really hope you fill out the evaluation survey. It is helpful to know what are your thoughts and feelings around this sort of content. Do you want more of it? Do you want less? Could it be done differently? Also want to let you know we'll be hosting a focus group sometime in April, I believe, to get some folks within our membership to talk about how's the PD program working? What do you like? What do you not like? So get some data and information from you folks and think about how we can do it better. So some upcoming events that we have at the college. This is all in our Eventbrite. So if you got here today, I know you've been on Eventbrite, which is really great. I'm really happy about. But we have three more Active Hope sessions. So part three next month in March is Mesosocial Work and Climate Justice with Kate Matheson. Part four in April is with Dr. Ingrid Waldron. We focus on environmental racism. Part five, which is in May, which isn't on Eventbrite yet, but should be soon, is with Louise Delisle, who's down in the Shelburne area, African Nova Scotian woman who is going to be sharing lots of insights and thoughts from her many years and generations of working in resistance to white supremacy and anti-Black racism and environmental racism. I'm really looking forward to that call. On Monday, we have our kickoff meeting for the National Social Work Month. Social work is everywhere. This is going to be myself, Alec, and Robert, our president for the college. Will be sharing some things about National Social Work Month. And it's an opportunity to connect with other social workers. So hopefully you can come. It's only 1 hour. And March 14th, we have a closed community of practice for Mi'kmaq and Indigenous social workers. And then on March 26th, we have our open communities of practice. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation or talking about climate justice or anything else that's, coming up in your practice area, come to the community of practice and share and talk with others. Also encourage you to follow and subscribe to our Eventbrite, our LinkedIn, our Facebook, our YouTube, and also sign up for our newsletter if you haven't yet. I imagine most of you have signed up for our newsletter. But again, all these links are available in the presentation. And that is it for today. Just want to reflect back some of the things that people are saying, leaving with new ideas, leaving with gratitude for connecting on these issues, leaving with a new framework for which to view climate change and hope that there are others out there helping to push this into the forefront of social work practice. Great session. Thank you. Leaving with some self-reflection to do and a feeling of needing to Marie Kondo my house. Oh, that's relatable. That's really funny. Um, to be clear about how I can insert more questioning into everyday conversations about climate justice and other important social political issues, and just some gratitude. So, folks, I will stop recording here, but I just want to say thank you so much for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and have